So probably most of you have noticed that Google is making some changes lately, and they're good changes. I Google something approximately 10,000 times a day, and when I do, I notice that what comes up is what Google thinks that you're looking for before you can even type it in all the way. It's really cool. And they bring up a picture, and they bring up all these things that they think that you're looking for. So this past week, in one of my many searches for things, I typed in the apostle. And when you think of the apostle, what comes to your mind? Paul. Okay, well, according to Google, you're wrong. Google says you did not mean the apostle Paul, which is what I thought maybe we would mean if we said the apostle. He's pretty famous. Google thinks you mean the apostle. It's the 1998 movie with Robert Duvall. So because this came up before I finished typing all this in, this movie, The Apostle, I started thinking about that movie. It's really good. I remember seeing it a while ago, and that movie is really fantastic. And you know how you go down the rabbit hole of the internet, and started thinking about the movie, and I watched a couple clips, and I was reading the synopsis and thinking of the movie again, and that's a really amazing story, The Apostle with Robert Duvall. Forget the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Robert Duvall, this is a great story. This movie, if you haven't seen it, and there will be spoilers, but it was 1998, so I'm not that sorry if I spoil it for you. Still go see it. It's a very good movie. But in this movie, Robert Duvall is called to be a preacher, a Pentecostal preacher, when he's about 10 years old. And it's kind of through his family, and it's kind of through God. It's kind of the same thing, but he's called to be a preacher. And so he preaches from the time he was a little boy, and he gets a church and a wife, Farrah Fawcett, may she rest in peace. And there's all this conflict with his wife, and one thing leads to another, and he gets very angry. And in the middle of a separation, he ends up killing someone. And he's a preacher. And he's been a preacher, and he ends up committing this crime. And so after he commits this crime, he runs, and he goes far away, he hides, and one would think after you commit this crime that you would just kind of hide from society, that you would kind of tuck yourself away, that you would try to do anything you can, maybe to make money, and just hide, because he was so ashamed, but he couldn't help starting to preach again. And before he knows it, he has a church full of people, all kinds of people, and it's a wonderful church, and he's preaching again, and he renames himself the Apostle. And so in this church, he's preaching, and it's wonderful, and all kinds of stuff happens, but his past catches up with him, and eventually police come to arrest him while he's preaching. And so he gives one last sermon, and it's really beautiful, and I read that it's based on some sermons he had heard. And through the process of making this movie, his faith was kind of restored to him, given back to the actor. So he's preaching in the final scene, and then the police come, and they take him away. And the last scene, he's in prison, and he's on a chain gang even. But what he's doing, even while he's in prison, those of you who've seen it, it's amazing. He's still preaching to the prisoners. He's preaching to his fellow prisoners, even at the very end. He can't escape this call, even though really he's done the worst thing he can possibly do. He's taken a life. But still, that call is on his life, and I love the way that they have his relationship with God. He yells at God, he rants at God, he does all kinds of stuff. In one part, he says, "God, I love you, but I'm really angry at you." And who hasn't been there? Maybe we're not honest enough to talk about it, but his relationship with God is like God is sitting right next to him. And he is very honest with God about what is up with him and God, and he doesn't understand where God is taking him. But where God is taking him is to preach his whole life long, is to share the gospel. So when I got to the end of that rabbit hole, I thought, okay, maybe Google wasn't wrong. Maybe there's a little bit of the Holy Spirit in the internet. Maybe when I was looking for the Apostle Paul and the apostle came up, it's a really beautiful story that's a lot like the story of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, who wrote the book of Galatians that we read from this morning, had a life that was not unlike this apostle who did the worst things possible and yet still had a call. The Apostle Paul talks about his life where he did the worst things possible. He participated in a murder of Stephen, another apostle. He persecuted the church of God, and it says in Galatians, he was even trying to destroy it. I think he's trying to tell them, I was the worst there is. I did the worst things you could possibly do against even the church. But he met Jesus on the road. And he talks a little bit about that story, about how he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and there was a light, and he fell over and met Jesus after God took some scales away from his eyes and he heard a voice. The Apostle Paul, his life is like, it's in two sections, before Jesus and after Jesus. But all along, you can see that God was working on his life. Even though he had done the worst things you could possibly do, God was still calling him. And so when Paul, who has had that kind of a life, says, I have been saved by grace, then you listen to him. And when the apostle Robert Duvall is saying to the people, he's been saved by grace, you listen to him because he's been to the worst place that a person can go. And God still saved him by grace. And so the Apostle Paul struggled with this. He said, I had followed the law, what I thought was the law. I had obeyed every rule. There is nobody who was more of a rule follower than me. And it still wasn't enough, right? It wasn't enough. And the same thing happened with Martin Luther. Martin Luther loved the book of Galatians. And he was another person that tried to keep the law. He tried to keep all the rules. He tried to do the best he could do at keeping the law, even to the extent of praying day and night and all of these things. And it came to him when he read Galatians that it would never be enough, that what we do never saves us, that we're only saved by faith. We know this, don't we? We've heard this for a long time, but still, I get calls and I have conversations, and I just talked to somebody recently, a lifelong Lutheran, who called and said, Pastor, I'm struggling with something. I don't think that I've done enough to be saved. Lifelong Lutheran. And I said, we can never do enough to be saved. And we can never hear enough that we're saved by God's grace, can we? Martin Luther wrote this whole huge commentary on the Galatians 500 years ago, and his commentary is way longer than the actual book. The book is only 6 chapters long, and his commentary goes on forever. Even Martin Luther in the beginning says, in his preface to this commentary, he says, I cannot believe that I have written all these words about Galatians. And yet there they all are, because this book meant so much to him, that you cannot be saved by works, that you can only save by grace. But he knew something else. Out of all of those words, after all of those things that he said about Galatians, there is one thing that he said that stuck with me. He says, to be convinced in our hearts that we have forgiveness of sins and peace with God by grace alone is the hardest thing. Isn't it? It's the hardest thing. To be convinced in our hearts that we have forgiveness of sins and peace with God by grace alone is the hardest thing. It was the hardest thing in the time of the Apostle Paul. It was the hardest thing in the time of Martin Luther. It's the hardest thing now for us to still believe, even though we've heard it, some of us, our whole lives. This message that we are good enough through the grace of God, and that the goal of our spiritual life is not to follow a set of rules that we've been handed down, but to live by faith. Living by faith, though, that's tough too. If you Google live by faith, you get a lot of pictures of the beach. I don't know why. Maybe it's those footprints in the sand that you're supposed to follow along in God's footsteps. And that old poem, Footprints, the one that I like best is when Jesus says, and when you wouldn't come, I dragged you. You left a trail there in the sand. Live by faith is not just about the beach and footprints in the sand. And living by faith, you'll also get some pictures of kittens, inexplicably, but it's the internet. There you go. Living by faith is more than that. But living by faith, which is the goal, I think, of our spiritual life as Christians, and especially as Lutheran Christians, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to describe. But if you will indulge me one more running metaphor, I'll go back earlier than the Apostle, the movie. There was a movie about a trail race. It's called the Dipsea 7. It's a 7-mile race in the Bay Area around San Francisco, and you go on this trail up and over a mountain, and it's a very technical race. It's really tough. There's a lot of roots and stumps and all those kinds of things you'll get on a trail race. It's it's what's called a technical trail. It's 7 miles of kind of scrambling, and there's parts where you go around, and it's a tough hike no matter what. But in this movie, there's a man who decides to run the race, and he is a man who is blind. He decides to take on this trail race. But he does it with a guide. And so they show him at the very beginning of the race, and he grabs his guide's arm. And now this is the early 1980s, so there weren't any joggers. They were all runners, like actual runners. And when the gun went off, they just took off. So this man without sight is grabbing on to his guide's hand, and they're running just as fast as anybody else. And you can hear the guide saying, to the left, and so they shift to the left, and you can hear the guide saying, there's a root, jump over the root, and you can hear the guide say, rock on your right. So they jump over the rock, and you can see him literally guiding him all along the path, and there's a barrier in the way, and he says, up and over, and so they both go up and over. And when there's a downhill, his guide gets in front of him, and he literally goes in his footsteps, holding on to his shoulders as they go downhill. And they get down to a road, and they're still running so fast, and he's still got his guide's arm, and they're running, and they go through the finish line, still holding on to the guide's arm. And I thought, that is living by faith. We sing this hymn, we walk by faith and not by sight, but that's it for real. Walking by faith in a guide, not by what you see on the ground. That's living by faith, that we grab someone's arm, that we grab the arm of Jesus. Even though we can't see a few steps in front of us, we hear a guide telling us what obstacles are in our path. The obstacles don't move, but we have a guide that's with us, helping us get through the things that are tricky, that are tough. And when we go uphill, you could hear the guide say, we're going to go uphill now. It's going to be a while. It's going to be a long climb. Sometimes Jesus says that to us. It's going to be a long time. This one's going to be a tough one. But I'm right here beside you, holding your hand. Amen.